Chapter 7, 20th Century Theories. The Withering Away of Law and the State. Evgeni Pashukanis. One of the most serious attempts to collate and to develop Marxist theory of law was made by the Russian legal theorist Evgeni Pashukanis. His most important text, Law and Marxism, was written in 1924 as one contribution to the extremely rich theoretical discussions on law and the state which were held in the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution. The particular strength of Pashukanis' work was that he sought to derive a Marxist theory of law, not merely from this or that occasion on which Marx happened to comment about the law, but from the method which Marx developed in his critique of political economy. Pashukanis developed both the analogy between and the common derivation of commodity fetishism and legal fetishism, of the theory of value and the theory of right. Thus he analyzed law as a historical form of regulation, expressing the emergence of definite social relations between individuals, just as Marx analyzed value and capital as the expression of definite social relations. Pashukanis demonstrated that the category of, quote, law is not a generic category that can be applied to the authority relations of any and every society, but rather a specific category valid only as a representation of a particular kind of authority relation. This constituted a great advance over theories of law which either ignored the form of law and equated law with authority in general, or idealized the form of law, dissociated it from social relations, and presented it as the natural and eternal condition of any and every social order. Pashukanis' brief critiques of, quote, vulgar materialism, end quote, i.e. of theories of law which subordinate the form of law to the law's content, and of, quote, formalism, i.e. theories of law which subordinate the content of law to law's form, still stand today as a valid and important starting point for Marxist theories of law. The political significance of Pashukanis' theory lay in his rejection of economism, in the sense that he saw the transition to communism as signifying not only a transformation of economic relations, but alongside that, also a transformation of authority relations between individuals. His great strength lay in the clarity with which he saw the legal forms of authority have characteristics which make them unsuitable as a basis on which communist society could be regulated, however necessary they may be in the course of the transition to communism. Pashukanis brought out the fetishism of legal relations, that is, the abstraction of legal subjects from their real qualities as natural and social individuals, the formal character of legal equality and freedom, which abstract from rather than overcome the real inequalities and dependencies which mark relations between individuals in society, the manner in which legal relations express and reproduce social relations based on the conflict of private interests, mutual indifference, and all-round competitiveness, rather than relations based on mutual cooperation, love, comradeship, the collective pursuit of a common goal. Imagine, Pashukanis said, what a marriage would look like if it were based purely on the defense of private rights and the putting forward of legal claims. Such a, quote, marriage might be necessary in bourgeois society, but could not possibly be the goal of how individuals should relate to one another under communism. A legal relation is a definite kind of relation, which first of all has to be distinguished from other kinds and then has to be criticized from the perspective of the cooperative, communal ways in which individuals should relate to each other under communism, where the atomistic pursuit of individuals of their private interest gives way to the collective pursuit by individuals of their common interest. In private law, Pashukanis writes, quote, the a priori assumptions of legal thought are clothed in the flesh and blood of two disputing parties defending their own rights. The dogma of private law is nothing more than an endless claim of arguments pro and contra, imaginary claims. The basic assumption of legal regulation is thus the opposition of private interests. At the same time, The opposition of private interest is the logical premise of the legal form, end quote. Pashukanis showed how, in the course of their development, legal relations take on, or at the same time, the latter is the logical premise of the legal form. End quote, Pashukanis. Pashukanis showed how, in the course of their development, legal relations take on the objective form of a third party representing the law, who acts as a mediator between the conflicting claims of rival parties. The fetishism of law is thereby increased as a social relation of domination between one individual and another appears in the mystified form of mutual subordination to an impersonal authority. Authority, in other words, is abstracted from the relations between people, of which it is in fact an expression. The quote, law appears as a subject in its own right divorced from individuals, set at the time, The quote, law appears as a subject in its own right divorced from individuals. At the same time, the law appears as neutral arbitrator between rival claimants, where it in fact puts its social weight behind one claimant or another, and so, quote, resolves, end quote, disputes by virtue of its power rather than its impartiality. In this role, the law represents itself as the public interest, whereas in reality, the law is one private interest among others. The emergence of the state takes this fetishism to its highest point, since the class relations take the form not of direct domination of one class by another, but of indirect domination mediated by the state. This mediation, Pashukanis argued, on the one hand mystifies power, since class domination no longer appears as what class domination is, and on the other creates a mighty apparatus that crushes society beneath its weight. This was not, Pashukanis concluded, the form of power suitable for communist society. Pashukanis's abstract language may easily obscure the nub of a fine argument, which has its roots deep within Marxism. At the same time, however, Pashukanis did not simply reflect Marx. Pashukanis also gave his theory of law his own mark and character, which diverged significantly from that of Marx and in my view signified a regression from Marx and not an advance over Marx. This divergence from Marx was both theoretical and political. Whereas Marx derived law from relations of commodity production, Pashukanis derives law from commodity exchange. This was the essence of Marx and Pashukanis's difference. Marx wrote, quote, "The relationship of rulers and ruled," end quote, is determined by the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers. That is, quote, "It is always the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers, a relation always naturally corresponding to a definite stage in the development of the methods of labor and thereby its social productivity, which reveals the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure." End quote. Pashukanis, by contrast, argued that the elementary legal category from which all other legal categories arise, that of, quote, juridic subject, end quote, emerges out of relations of exchange between what he alternatively calls, quote, guardians of commodities, end quote, or, quote, owners of private property, end quote. Theoretically, Pashukanis's confusion stemmed from the fact that Marx first wrote about the emergence of juridic forms in Capital at the beginning of his chapter on the, quote, process of exchange, end quote. And this led Pashukanis and many others since to believe that Marx derived juridic forms from exchange, which was not the case and which belied the method he created for analyzing economic forms. Pashukanis argued that in exchange, just as the product takes on the form of value, so too the owner takes on the form of juridic subject, but the analog should not be between produce and owner, but rather between product and producer. It is the producers of commodities who appear in exchange relations as no more than owners of private property, regardless of how they acquired that property. or of what that property comprises, or of what they need to reproduce that property. If one looks only at the surface of society, then, as we have traced in our review of Marx, exchange appears not as what exchange is, a moment in the cycle of production, but an abstraction from productive relations. This was the view taken by bourgeois jurisprudence when it idealized the freedom, equality, security, independence of exchangers. But this view is also the perspective of Pashukanis when he revealed the dark side, competitiveness, mutual indifference, egoism of the exchange relation. Marx's analysis, and this is particularly clear in the Grundrisse, focused on both these aspects of exchange. It is as erroneous to give privilege to the freedom and equality of exchange relations as their only truth, as it is to give privilege to private interest and disregard for others, which they also express. For Marx, the point was to grasp that the form of exchange possesses both these characteristics, i.e., of equality, freedom, etc., and of egoism, mutual indifference, etc. It was as one-sided of Pashukanis to subordinate equality and freedom to egoism and mutual indifference as it was of bourgeois jurisprudence to do the reverse. Pashukanis offered a, quote, negative, end quote, critique of forms of law which ignored the forms of law's egalitarian and democratic aspects, in contrast to bourgeois jurisprudence, which offered a, quote, positive idealization, end quote, of forms of law, which ignored, in contrast to bourgeois jurisprudence, which offered a, quote, positive, end quote, idealization of forms of law, which ignored what had been called its, quote, effects of isolation and individuation, end quote. Both Pashukanis and bourgeois jurisprudence thereby missed the contradictory nature of legal forms. Pashukanis offered an abstract negation of bourgeois jurisprudence, simply reversing bourgeois jurisprudence's portrayal of law, highlighting bourgeois jurisprudence's dark side over its light side, without yet seeing law in, as Marx called it, its, quote, multifacetedness, end quote. On the other hand, Marx revealed that the content of exchange is determined by relations of production, and that quite different relations of production, for example, simple commodity production, capitalist production, state capitalist production, socialist production, will be expressed and mediated in exchange. Pashukanis and bourgeois jurisprudence have in common their abstraction of exchange from relations of production. The consequence of Pashukanis' abstraction of exchange from production was to give his approach to law an entirely different coloration from that of Marx's, a coloration which lost sight of the dialectic. Instead of seeing both the content and forms of law as determined by and changing with the development of productive relations, Pashukanis isolated law from law's content and reduced quite different forms of law, expressing qualitatively different social relations, to a single static and illusory, quote, legal form, end quote. Marx expressed the contradictory aspects of the form of law when he wrote that, quote, the real point about exchange, quote, is not that each individual's pursuit of his private interest promotes the totality of private interest, the general interest. One could just as well deduce from this abstract phrase that each individual reciprocally blocks the assertions of others' interests, so that instead of a general affirmation, this war of all against all produces a general negation, end quote. The real point, he immediately added, is to break from this abstract way of posing the issue and instead relate form to content. Quote, the point is rather that the private interest is already a socially determined interest. The private interest's content, as well as the forms and means of the private interest realization, is given by social conditions independent of all, end quote. Thus, as Marx adds in the Critique of the Gotha program, both the form and the content of exchange are changed with the transition from capitalist to socialist relations of production, even though exchange itself persists until the communist principle of, quote, to each according to their needs, quote, to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities, end quote, finally breaks exchange relations down in their entirety. This whole process going on beneath the surface of exchange was made invisible by Pashukanis' theory of law. Pashukanis derived the legal category of, quote, juridic subject, end quote, from the, quote, owner of private property, end quote, or, quote, guardian of commodities, end quote. In so doing, Pashukanis thought he was moving from the juridic form to the juridic form's social content. In fact, however, the idea of owning private property is itself a juridic form. Instead of moving from a juridic form to that juridic form's social content, Pashukanis was in reality moving from one juridic form to another juridic form. In other words, Pashukanis never escaped the realm of juridic forms. In spite of his awareness of the pitfalls of formalism, this was precisely what Pashukanis ended up offering. The problem stemmed from Pashukanis' often stated conviction that the category of, quote, abstract juridic subject, end quote, is the elementary category of law, whereas the abstract juridic subject is in fact a developed legal category which depends on the generalization of legal relations. 1 second. Come on. In other words, Pashukanis never escaped the realm of juridic forms. In spite of his awareness of the pitfalls of formalism, this was precisely what he ended up offering. The problem stemmed from his often stated conviction that the category of, quote, abstract juridic subject, end quote, is the elementary category of law, whereas the abstract juridic subject is in fact a developed legal category which depends on the generalization of legal relations. Pashukanis recognized this at one point in his discussion when he observed that in the early stages of legal relations reflected in feudal custom, quote, every right is thought of merely as an attribute of a specific concrete subject. Each right was a privilege. Each city, each estate, each guild lived according to its law, which followed a man wherever he was. The idea of a formal legal status common to all citizens, general for all people, was absent in this period. To the extent that in the Middle Ages, the abstract concept of legal subject was absent. So, also, the idea of an objective norm was mixed and merged in the establishment of concrete privileges and liberties, end quote. The elementary legal category is that of the, quote, owner of private property, end quote. One in which the individual is still attached to particular possessions and not yet abstracted as a juridic subject in general. While Pashukanis thought that in moving from, quote, the juridic subject, end quote, to the, quote, owner of commodity, end quote, he was moving from the juridic form to the juridic form's social content. In fact, Pashukanis was moving from a developed legal form to the elementary legal form. Pashukanis' abstraction of exchange from production led Pashukanis to offer an entirely abstract critique of law. While Pashukanis learnt from Marx that equality before the law necessarily entails inequality in fact, Pashukanis did not appear to learn either that equality before the law provides a measure, albeit limited and formal but not illusory, of equality, or that the inequalities which equality before the law entails are of an entirely different order depending on whether they derive from commodity, capitalist, or social relations of production. Opposition to inequality in general should not blind us to the distinction between one kind of inequality and another. At the same time, while Pashukanis learnt from Marx that exchange gives rise to the legal form, Pashukanis did not learn that, depending on the nature of productive relations in which it is inserted, exchange gives rise to different legal forms. Opposition to the legal form in general should not blind us to the distinction between one legal form and another. Pashukanis explained the development of legal forms from subjective rights to objective law to the state, entirely in terms of the extension, deepening, and generalization of exchange relations. Thus, as far as its effects on juridic forms was concerned, Pashukanis saw the transition from petty commodity production to capitalist production, and then from capitalist production to socialist production, purely in terms of the generalization and restriction of exchange respectively, and not in terms of the transformation of productive relations. Different legal forms seem to Pashukanis to represent merely the quantitative extent to which exchange was present in society, rather than any qualitative difference in productive relations. Thus, all legal forms appear to Pashukanis to express the same basic relation of exchange. While Pashukanis' strength was to see the common origins of right, law, and the state as the three fundamental juridic forms, Pashukanis failed to perceive the distinction between right, law, and the state. It was as if an economist were to equate money and capital simply because they both derive from value. This is why class relations appeared to Pashukanis as external and unrelated to the form of state in his eyes. The state derived from the generalization of exchange relations and not from the development of capitalist relations of production. Class domination in Pashukanis' theory was therefore reflected in external intrusions into the state, in the buying up of the state by the banks, in the corruption of the state, or in the abandonment of the state in favor of direct naked force. It was concealed by the state form, but it was not expressed in the state form. Such were the theoretical limitations of Pashukanis' formalism. Pashukanis' Law and Marxism was not merely an abstract theoretical critique of law, but was intended and served as a political intervention into the politics of the transition period. The strength of his intervention lay in his attempt to grasp the transitory function of law in the transition to socialism against those who, on the one hand, wished to abolish law immediately on the grounds that it was a bourgeois form of regulation which had no place in socialist society, and against those who, on the other, uncritically accepted legal forms of regulation as appropriate for communist society, and who thus wished to substitute proletarian for bourgeois law. To Pashukanis, law appeared unequivocally as a bourgeois form of regulation, but also as one which was temporarily necessary under socialism until conditions were such that, quote, the narrow horizon of bourgeois right, end quote, could be transcended in the narrow horizon of bourgeois rights entirety. The timeliness of Pashukanis' intervention, Law and Marxism, appeared in 1924, was this. In the first period of Bolshevik rule, that known as, quote, war communism, end quote, the erosion of legal forms under the exigencies of civil war gave rise to utopian dreams of moving immediately, as Lenin put it, quote, by direct assault, end quote, to a society in which law and state would no longer exist, just as the financial breakdown characteristic of this period also gave rise to utopian illusions about the immediate withering away of money. In the second period of Bolshevik rule, that known as the new economic policy, the restoration of legality along with that of exchange relations, the market, currency stability, etc., gave rise to conservative ideas of, quote, proletarian law and, quote, proletarian state, which subordinated the Marxist critique of the bourgeois character of law and the state. Against the first tendency, Pashukanis argued that, quote, law could never be higher than the economic conditions of society, end quote, and that the Soviet Union was not yet ripe for its abolition. Against the second, he argued that the concept of, quote, proletarian law, end quote, is a contradiction in terms, given the bourgeois nature of the form of law itself. The long-term goal should remain the withering away of law in the law's entirety. The immediate prospect, on the other hand, was the gradual withering away of the legal form. It was the strength of this dual critique of legal theory which undoubtedly won for Pashukanis his enormous reputation in the Soviet Union. Pashukanis traced the logic of the connection between commodity exchange and legal regulation. On this basis, argued for the twofold nature of the transition to communism. It was to be both an economic process involving the replacement of market relations by planned production and distribution, and a juridic process involving the replacement of legal regulation by what Pashukanis called, quote, technical, end quote, forms of regulation. In this respect, the charge that Pashukanis was, quote, economistic, end quote, is not strong, since Pashukanis conceived of the transition as comprising not only a transformation of economic relations, but also a self-conscious and planned transformation of authority relations. The problem, however, in Pashukanis' intervention lay in its abstractness. The principal issue which divided left, center, and right in the Soviet Union, personified respectively by Trotsky, Stalin, and Bukharin, was not over whether or not there was a connection between exchange and law, but over the extent to which the forms in which exchange and legal relations should be reinstituted. The new economic policy, with it the new legal policy, both reflected and brought about a massive proliferation of exchange relations. The key question concerned first the content of exchange, to what extent private property rights should be upheld, what were to be the limits of inheritance, to what degree was private employment of labor to be permitted, on what terms was the, quote, city, end quote, to exchange with the, quote, country, end quote. Were state companies to have the right to dismiss workers? Were workers to have the right to criticize and dismiss their managers? What rights of appeal against the decision of the bureaucracy were to be granted to citizens? What level of wages were workers to receive? Were private entrepreneurs to have the right to foreign exchange with external capitalists, etc.? But Pashukanis' formalism led him to ignore or at least relegate questions of juridic content. This saved him from taking political sides, but it also divorced his analysis from many of the concrete issues of the day. The other key question concerned the forms of exchange. How, for instance, were the courts to be organized? Were judges to be elected and revocable? And if so, on what basis? How far would the independence of the judiciary from the bureaucracy be upheld? What rights of working class organization independently of the state would be upheld? To what extent would the bureaucracy be subordinated to popular representative assemblies? Would inter-party democracy be restored? What forms would punishment of criminals take? Etc. Pashukanis' subordinated analysis of the forms of law and state appropriate to socialist transition to the single question of the quantitative reduction of legal regulations. It seemed to Pashukanis that the transition was marked merely by the gradual restriction of commodity exchange rather than by a transformation of relations of production, and by the gradual restriction of legal relations rather than by their transformation. The struggle for qualitatively new forms of law and state, forms that would be more democratic than any that were possible in bourgeois society, was subordinated by Pashukanis to a struggle simply for less law. This abstract perspective was directly associated with a theory of law which derived its development solely from the generalization of exchange and its withering away solely from the restriction of exchange. The most unfortunate aspect of Pashukanis' approach lay in his conception of the relation between law and state. Pashukanis' emphasis on the, quote, withering away, end quote, of law in anticipation of the, quote, withering away, end quote, of the state meant in effect the subordination of legal forms of the state to the state's other forms, and especially to the bureaucracy. Thus Pashukanis reversed Marx's doctrine of the independence of the judiciary from the executive. In the context of Pashukanis' silence on the question of political democracy, Pashukanis' intervention could only lend support for precisely what Marx saw as the very mark of alienation of the state from society, namely the uninhibited power of the bureaucracy. This dimension of his work was reinforced by his entirely uncritical embrace of, quote, technical, end quote, forms of regulation as the, quote, socialist, end quote, alternative to law. Where am I? Lost my spot. Pashukanis argued that while the opposition of private interest is the premise of law, quote, unity of purpose, end quote, is the premise of, quote, technical regulation, end quote. In bourgeois society, Pashukanis believed both forms coexist, with technical regulation being embodied in the organization of postal and railroad services, military affairs, doctor-patient relationships, the education of criminals, and most important of all, though Pashukanis was not consistent on this one, in the internal organization of the capitalist enterprise. He believed that under socialism, as the state sector gradually won predominance over the private sector, so technical forms of authority would predominate over legal forms. What gave rise to Pashukanis' naively uncritical view of authority relations within the state bureaucracy and enterprises was his blindness to productive relations and his conviction that bourgeois society left its mark only in the form of exchange. For Marx, by contrast, capitalist relations of production determine not only legal forms but also the bureaucratic forms of authority which are instituted within the workplace and within the state. Pashukanis' inability to follow this side of Marx's critique of capitalism led to an uncritical view of the internal relations which characterized the state sector in the Soviet Union. Law is not the only form of regulation assumed by capitalist productive relations, and thus the elimination of law does not entail the elimination of bourgeois forms of regulation in toto. The theoretical source of Pashukanis' concept of, quote, technical regulation, end quote, derived, I believe, from his misunderstanding of Marx's category of the, quote, technical division of labor, end quote. Marx differentiated in Capital between the division of labor in society among independent units of production based on the exchange of commodities, which he called, quote, social, end quote, and the division of labor within the workplace among related units of production based on planned allocation of labor and distribution of products, which he called, quote, technical, end quote. But by the concept of, quote, technical division of labor, end quote, he did not mean that the division of labor did not take a socially determinate capitalist form. Every form of cooperative labor, Marx argued, requires that there be instituted some form of regulation in order to accomplish the purely technical task of coordinating the various elements within the cooperative labor process. But what form of regulation depends on the social character of cooperation? Marx distinguished between the technical characteristics of cooperation in general, those of increasing the productivity of labor, of socializing individuals, etc., and the social characteristics of capitalist cooperation, the prime purpose of which is the production and expropriation of surplus value. The problem of imposing discipline under these circumstances is that of imposing capitalist discipline, i.e., the regulation of capital by capital of alienated labor. Since it is only the capitalists who can bring together laborers as to allow them to cooperate in the labor process, is the capitalist who appears as the personification of the conditions of social production. Quote, through the cooperation of numerous wage laborers, the command of capital develops into a requirement for carrying on the labor process itself, into a real condition of production. That a capitalist should command in the field of production is now as indispensable as that of a general should command in the battlefield, end quote. In manufacture, cooperation on the basis of handicraft leaves the independence of the producer partially intact. The task of grinding down this independence gives rise to a special supervisory force. The capitalist, quote, hands over the work of direct and constant supervision of the individual worker and groups of workers to a special kind of wage laborer. An industrial army under the command of a capitalist requires, like a real army, officers, managers, NCOs, foremen, overseers, who command during the labor process in the name of capital, end quote. Since handicraft skill is still the basis of manufacture, and, quote, since the mechanism of manufacture as a whole possesses no objective framework which would be independent of the workers themselves, capital is constantly compelled to wrestle with the insubordination of the workers, end quote. The battles that were fought out between labor and capital, moved in to a new terrain, however, as capital turned to the introduction of machinery as the basis for meeting the contradictions unleashed between the narrow technical basis of manufacture and the productive force which it generated. It is always the case formally in capitalist production that it is the conditions of production which employ the worker rather than the worker employing the conditions of production. However, quote, it is only with the coming of machinery that the inversion first acquires a technical and palpable reality, end quote. The authority of the capitalist was now technically integrated with the very machinery of production, a fusion premised no longer on the appendage of the tool to the craftsperson, but rather the appendage of the worker to the machine. Thus were born all the illusions about, quote, technical, end quote, control, which Pashukanis inherited. Technical forms of regulation were accompanied by the establishment of authoritarian hierarchies of control within the workplace. But these hierarchies appeared as the technical conditions of production. Quote, on the basis of capitalist production, the mass of direct producers is confronted by the social character of production in the form of strictly regulated authority and a social mechanism of the labor process organized on a complete hierarchy. This authority reaching its bearers, however, only as the personification of the conditions of labor in contrast to labor, and not as political or theocratic rulers under earlier modes of production, end quote. Pashukanis cited this passage but failed to integrate this passage into his analysis. Marx's analysis revealed the dual nature of the authority of the capitalist. The capitalist is in charge of the technical tasks of coordination, which belong to any form of large-scale productive enterprise, and at the same time he is in charge of the process of extracting surplus value out of the labor of workers, a task which exists only under certain definite conditions of production. Thus the technical and capitalist functions of the capitalist control of the workplace coexist, but the technical and capitalist functions of capitalist control of the workplace assume the appearance of representing the conditions of production alone. The class nature of authority appears as if it were a purely technical authority, even when this authority is imposed in the most arbitrary of ways. What we in fact see here is not technical control, but a definite class form of control emerging out of capitalist production relations. Pashukanis transposed his technicist conception of capitalist productive relations onto productive relations within the state sector of the Soviet economy. He could then pass off bureaucratic forms of control within this sector as merely technical. The theoretical ground was thus cleared for an uncritical view of social relations of production within the arena of state-planned production. Pashukanis, like many other Marxists of his time, conceived of the transition from capitalism to socialism simply in terms of the replacement of commodity exchange by planned production, which Pashukanis equated with the replacement of bourgeois, i.e. legal forms of regulation, by socialist, i.e. technical forms. Quote, until the task of the construction of a single planned economy is realized, so long as the market bond between individuals and groups of enterprises remains, the form of law will also remain in force this long. The form of private property remains almost unchanged in the transitional period in small-scale peasantry and crafts economy. To the extent that state enterprises are subordinated to the conditions of circulation, so the bond between them is shaped not in the form of technical subordination but in the form of exchange. Thus, a purely legal procedure for regulating relations becomes possible and necessary. However, along with this, there has been preserved, and with the passage of time, undoubtedly will be strengthened, direct, that is, technical management, in the form of programs, production and distribution plans, etc. Its gradual victory will mean the gradual withering away of the legal form in general. End quote. Pashukanis. Every cooperative labor process assumes some social form in which technical tasks are fulfilled. There is no way by which the, quote, technical can somehow replace the social. No higher form of society is possible in which social relations of control can metamorphose themselves into purely technical forms. What always has to be considered is the interaction of technical and social factors. This is true of capitalist production, but it is also true of planned production under socialism. Failure to see this led Pashukanis to accompany his negative critique of legal fetishism with an uncritical adoption of technical fetishism. Such was Pashukanis' logic in law and Marxism. As the years went by, so the logic was played out. For example, in 1929, Pashukanis accepted Stalin's view that communism was being achieved with the introduction of the first five-year plan, and he drew the conclusion that, quote, the role of the pure juridical superstructure, the role of law, is now diminishing, and from this one can infer the general rule that technical regulation becomes more effective as the role of law becomes weaker and less significant. End quote. This was written at the time when bureaucratic terror and the suppression of independent organization of workers and peasants was reaching a crescendo. Trotsky offered the wry observation in Revolution Betrayed that when in 1931 Stalin declared that, quote, the last relics of capitalist elements in our economy have been liquidated, end quote, certain, quote, incautious Moscow theoreticians, end quote, took this on faith and inferred the withering away of law and state. Pashukanis more cautiously hedged his bets and saved his skin for a few years, until 1937, by positing the abolition of law without the abolition of the state. Thus, the bureaucratic form of the state was to survive as the embodiment of technical regulation, while the legal form was to wither away as the embodiment of bourgeois fetishism. Not only did Pashukanis invert the relationship between law and bureaucracy envisaged by Marx, he lost all sight of the democratic nature of Marx's critique of the state, according to which its withering away was to be the result of its ever more radical democratization. Pashukanis's overcritical view of law, combined with his uncritical view of bureaucracy, formed an unfortunate mixture, especially in the context of a regime which increasingly identified the bureaucracy with the state and the state with the people. Rule of Law and Class Struggle, Edward Thompson. Appreciation. One of the greatest strengths of Edward Thompson's recent contributions to Marxist theory of law and the state lies in the close ties he draws between theory and politics, in a period in which theories of law and the state have often been confined to academe and dissociated from class struggle. Thompson's passionate polemical concerns come as a welcome antidote to the dangers of academicism and sterility facing contemporary Marxism. Thompson's polemic was directed against threats to civil liberties and democratic rights emanating from the modern state. In the terms of his own preferred imagery, the branches of the, quote, liberty tree, end quote, are being lopped off one by the state, and the, quote, freeborn Englishman, end quote, is in danger of becoming a chattel to state power. Thompson's list of attacks on liberty is a long list. The list includes, quote, management of news, the blackmailing of politicians, the political vetting of civil servants, the clipping of the coinage of civil liberties, the enlargement of police powers, the dissemination of calumny against dissenters, the corruption of the jury system, the surveillance and intimidation of radicals, the management of state trials, the orchestration through the media of a, quote, law and order, end quote, grande pure, and the cry of, quote, national interest, end quote, end quote. Not to speak of the rapid erosion of trade union rights to strike in sympathy with fellow workers, to picket, or even, under some circumstances, to belong to a union. The principal, quote, muggers of the Constitution, end quote, to employ Thompson's vivid phrase, are not the, quote, criminals, terrorists, and subversives, end quote, upon whom blame is heaped by the right. They come rather from the state itself, not from below, but from above. In the context of this drift towards an authoritarian state, it is essential, Thompson argued, that modern Marxism put its own house in order. Modern Marxism's ambivalence about civil liberties and modern Marxism's tendency to dismiss all law as merely an instrument of or camouflage for class rule must be abandoned. If civil liberties are merely an illusion obscuring the harsh realities of class rule, then the only significance of their loss is that it clarifies the class struggle. If law is merely an instrument of capital, then attacks on democratic rights initiated by the state present no danger to the working class. If all states are, quote, inherently profoundly authoritarian, end quote, and if all inhibitions on their power are, quote, masks or disguises or tricks to provide the state with ideological legitimation, end quote, then the move from one form of state to another will appear to make no essential difference, and the erosion of inhibitions on state power will merely clarify state power's repressive nature. Such a rhetoric, Thompson argued, reduces Marxism's democratic critique of the state to no more than a cynicism. It has nothing in common with genuine Marxism and is bankrupt historically, theoretically, and politically. Politically, cynicism leads to a dulling of the, quote, nerve of outrage, end quote, when liberties are removed. If rights are just an illusion covering up exploitation and oppression, then rights are not worth fighting for. Historically, cynicism leads Marxists to devalue popular struggles against wealth and power for the achievement of political liberty. On the basis of 20th century experience, quote, even the most exalted thinker, end quote, ought to be able to note the difference between a state based on the rule of law and a state based on the, quote, exercise of arbitrary extra-legal authority, end quote. If the only significant distinction observed is that between different, quote, modes of production, end quote, feudal, capitalist, and socialist, then distinctions which are equally important between one form of bourgeois rule and another are lost from sight. Political liberty under bourgeois rule is not just a device of capital, but represents the tangible achievement of struggles from below and can be secured only through the continued pursuit of such struggles. Theoretically, Thompson polemicized against a, quote, essentialism, end quote, according to which, quote, a Platonic notion of the truth, Theoretically, Thompson polemicized against, quote, an essentialism, end quote, according to which, quote, a Platonic notion of the true ideal capitalist state, end quote, is substituted for analysis and critique of actualist capitalist states in all capitalist states' diversity. Thompson attacked the base superstructure model, which presents law as, quote, merely part of the superstructure of productive forces and relations, end quote. Thompson rejected the, quote, reductionism, end quote, in which the law appears to define, quote, what shall be property and what shall be crime, end quote, in ways necessarily, quote, confirming and consolidating class power, end quote. Law, Thompson argues, should be seen not just as an instrument of class domination, nor just as a force that functions for the reproduction of class relations, but also as a, quote, form of mediation, end quote, between and within the classes. Law's function is not just to serve power and wealth, but also to impose, quote, effective inhibitions upon power, end quote, and to subject, quote, the ruling class to the ruling class's own rules, end quote. Law acts not just as a means of repression, but also as, quote, a defense of the citizen from power's all-inclusive claims, end quote. It not only throws a veil over the class struggle, it also shapes it. If law is to be effective as a form of legitimation for the rulers, then the rulers must, to some degree, live up to the law's own universal and egalitarian standards. Thompson rejects the major theoretical premise which underwrites these tendencies within Marxism, that is, the isolation of the law as a distinctive part of the, quote, superstructure, end quote, separated from its, quote, base, end quote, or in structuralist language, the conception of law as a determinate, quote, level, end quote, separate from that of, quote, economics, end quote, the determining level, politics, and ideology. These abstractions, he argues, afford a Marxist legitimation for, quote, carrying on with age-old academic procedures of isolation which are abjectly disintegrative of the enterprise of historical materialism, the understanding of the full historical process, end quote. It is not possible to understand law in isolation from productive relations, just as it is not possible to understand productive relations in isolation from law. Productive relations and law intermingle so intimately that the isolation of one from the other can be done only by means of a forced abstraction. Thus Thompson writes of his studies of the 1700s, quote, I found that law did not keep politely to a, quote, level, end quote, but was at every bloody level. Law was imbricated within the mode of production and productive relations themselves, as property rights definitions of agrarian practice, and was simultaneously present in the philosophy of Locke. It intruded brusquely within alien categories, appearing bewigged and gowned in the guise of ideology. Law danced a cotillion with religion, moralizing over the theater of Tyburn. Law was an arm of politics, and politics was one of law's arms. Law was an academic discipline, subjected to the rigor of its own autonomous logic. Law contributed to the self-identity both of rulers and of ruled. Above all, law afforded an arena for class struggle within which alternative notions of law were fought out, end quote. In other words, productive relations are meaningful only in terms of their definition at law. In other words, productive relations are meaningful only in terms of their definition at law. Quote, men enjoy petty property rights or agrarian use rights whose definition was inconceivable without the forms of law, end quote. What unites these different, quote, levels, end quote, or, quote, instances, end quote, or rather what makes problematic their initial separation is the fact that they reflect the unitary experience of real historical actors. Quote, we are talking about men and women in their material life, in their determinate relationships, in their experience of these, and in their self-consciousness of this experience. Class experience will find simultaneous expression in all these, quote, instances, quote, levels, institutions, and activities. It is the, quote, same unitary experience, end quote, which gives rise to fear of the crowd in, quote, politics, end quote, reappearing as contempt for manual labor among the genteel, reappearing as black acts in the, quote, law, end quote, reappearing as doctrines of subordination in, quote, religion, end quote, end quote. Thompson. Productive relations, in other words, are themselves legal, political and cultural as well as economic. The relation between capital and labor is one whose class character appears only via its multiple forms of expression. Law is not a servant of economics, even in the last instance. They both reflect, rather, the same, quote, unitary, end quote, class experience. Indeed, quote, the very category of economics, the notion that it is possible to isolate economic phenomenon from non-economic social relations, that all human obligations can be dissolved except the cash nexus, was the product of a particular phase of capitalist development, end quote. Capitalist society is founded upon, quote, forms of exploitation which are simultaneously economic, moral, and cultural, end quote. Social and cultural phenomenon, like the law, do not, quote, trail after economics at some remote remove, end quote. But social and cultural phenomenon are rather, quote, immersed in the same nexus of relationship, end quote. If we accept the metaphor of base superstructure, the base should be seen as, quote, not just economic, but human, a characteristic human relationship entered into involuntarily in the productive process, end quote. Law is as immediate an aspect of this human relationship as is economics. Just as Marx submitted economic categories, quote, to the test of history, end quote, so too, Thompson argued, legal categories must be submitted to the same test, not reified as self-sufficient and as a self-sufficient and eternal sphere of social life, but grasped as the historical expression of definite productive relations. The reverse side of the coin of cynicism towards law and the state, Thompson argues, is an equally dangerous doctrine which identifies Marxism with the, quote, bureaucratic statism, end quote, both of the official labor and social democratic parties in the West and of Stalinism and Stalinism's heirs in the East. This doctrine portrays the state, quote, in all its aspects, end quote, as a, quote, public good, a defense of working people or of the little man against private vested interests, end quote. A distinction must be made, Thompson maintains, between the different elements of the state. While the legal and representative institution of the state constitutes its democratic element, the bureaucracy constitutes the omnipresent danger to democracy. Despotism, Thompson concludes, means the subordination of the state as a whole to bureaucracy. Liberty means the subordination of the bureaucracy to control by Parliament and the law. The consequence of the bureaucratic statism of the official left is that, quote, the dividing line between the welfare state and the police state become obscure, and bureaucracy in every form waxed fat in this obscurity, end quote. The welfare state is not the same as the police state, but the elevation of the state executive in the welfare state paves the way for the emergence of the police state. The key concept Thompson invokes in his critique is that of the, quote, rule of law, end quote. Its presence or lack of presence marks, in his view, the difference between liberty and despotism. The importance of Thompson's approach is that it restores the classic liberal usage of the concept of, quote, the rule of law, end quote, against its corruption in contemporary conservative thought. According to the latter, whatever the state dictates is law, and the doctrine of the, quote, rule of law, end quote, means an unconditional obligation to obey the state's law regardless of their form or content. The state's laws regardless of their form or content. From this point of view, according to which law is defined only in terms of law's origin, any measure enacted by the state, even the most draconian police measure, is law. The state cannot by this account violate the rule of law, because the state appears as the rule of law's embodiment. The classical liberal conception of the rule of law, by contrast, was based on what Thompson called a, quote, bloody-minded, end quote, distrust of the state. The state's commands were legitimate only if the state's commands accorded with definite formal standards of conduct. The state could not do anything the state wished and declared it to be law, and declare what the state does to be law. Rather, the state remained a bona fide state, and not a mere private force. For only if the state followed dictates associated with the rule of law. Thus a doctrine which started off as offering an ideal against which existing states should be measured as an inhibition on state power and as a precaution against despotism has been turned by modern conservatism in the name of liberalism, Adam Smith, etc., into a travesty of its former self. It's become little more than an apology for state power. Thompson has performed a great service in returning to the liberal idea of the rule of law in order to expose the poverty of present-day conservatism. This usage of the concept of, quote, rule of law, end quote, also reveals the shortcomings of a Marxism which either reduces law to class dictatorship or elevates the state as a whole as a human good. Thompson's depiction of, quote, statist, end quote, nihilistic, end quote, currents within contemporary Marxism is somewhat caricatured. Thompson's depiction between both statist and nihilistic structures Thompson's depiction of both statist and nihilistic currents within contemporary Marxism is somewhat caricatured. There are few Marxist or Marxist movements which fit neatly and foursquare into either of these images. Thompson's target is often broad, and he tends to conflate diverse currents. For example, a dismissive attitude to law affects some kind of, quote, libertarian, end quote, Marxism, which rejects all forms of authority equally, including law, and some kinds of, quote, authoritarian, end quote, Marxism, which rejects all forms of inhibition on working class power, including legal inhibitions. Their common position on law should not obscure their distinct starting points, even though it may facilitate a movement from one to the other. Sometimes Thompson's target is misplaced, as when his offhand dismissal of, quote, Leninism, end quote, cuts a swath through the historical record of Lenin's firm commitment to struggles for political liberty. However, the general thrust of Thompson's critique of statist and nihilistic currents within Marxist theory of law and the state is, in my view, pertinent, correct, and in accord with Marx's own writings. The problem lies not in Thompson's critique as such, but in the alternative Thompson puts forward. In rejecting, quote, economism and the, quote, vulgar Marxist, end quote, conceptions of law and the state with which it is associated, Thompson comes close to abandoning Marxist criticism of the rule of law in its entirety in favor of a resuscitated liberalism. In itself, this is, of course, no fault. We should not adhere to Marxism dogmatically. I wish to show, however, the contradictions inherent in Thompson's alternative, not in order to return to economism, but rather to deepen and extend a Marxist critique of economism. Hello.
Hello.
You got more stuff to bring in?
Nah, just us.
Okay. Critique. Thompson's repeated comment that the rule of law is, quote, an unqualified human good, end quote, is not only a case of his bending the stick too far away from legal nihilism and from bureaucratic statism. After all, the rule of law does not have to be an unqualified human good for its superiority over authoritarianism to be recognized and acted upon. There is no doubt that liberal forms of bourgeois rule are preferable from the point of view of democracy in the working class to authoritarian forms, even though both remain forms of bourgeois state based on class exploitation. The liberal state does not have to be abstracted from the liberal state's class content for the liberal state's value to be recognized and the liberal state's institutions to be defended against forces of reaction. That Thompson's defense of the rule of law was unqualified reveals the shortcomings of his general method. Thompson's initial rejection of reductionism turns into reductionism's opposite, when he too reduces the multiple functions of law to one essential function, that of inhibiting power. From an initial position which held that law is not only a means of domination and obfuscation, but also a restraint upon the state and a defense against repression, Thompson concludes that the defining characteristic of the rule of law lies in the one function of inhibition. Thompson's objections to monolithic views of the function of law do not prevent Thompson from replacing one monolith by another monolith. He recognizes other functions, but sees inhibition as essential. A critical understanding of the rule of law requires that we comprehend the many functions of law and the conflicts between them, not that we give privilege to one function of law as law's essence. So, too, Thompson's original argument that the law should be seen not just as an instrument of one class or another, nor simply in terms of its function or for reproducing class relations, but also in terms of its form of mediation, gives way to Thompson himself reducing the form of law to its function. In Thompson's view, the form of law is defined by its function of inhibition, with the result that the specific characteristics of legal inhibitions on state sovereignty are lost from sight. Law is not the only form of inhibition on state power. There are also the political institutions of representative democracy, not to speak of the independent organization of the working class on one side and the interest of capital and of other states on the other. The law possesses definite social characteristics as a means of inhibition on the power of the executive, and definite limits. The law tends to work through individual cases, thus bringing with it the danger that it might, quote, individuate, end quote, the collective struggles of the working class. The law imposes formal standards of comparability which might neglect the unequal class consequences of executive policy and practice. Law imposes sanctions only after the event, that is, after a specific abuse of power by the executive has taken place. The law functions through the mediation of courts, the judiciary, and the legal profession, who have their own specific class characteristics. For instance, the law serves as a vital inhibition on the power of the police. The law requires the police to bring detainees to court. The law allows for civil suits and criminal prosecutions against the police. The law permits the judiciary, under certain ever more restricted circumstances, to exclude evidence improperly obtained by the police. Law provides a public forum in which the police may be interrogated. But it is not the only form of inhibition on the police. There are also political restraints in the shape of local authority police committees in Parliament, and unofficial restraints in the shape of trade union picket lines, self-defense groups, and on the other side, those arising from the organized pressure of capital. In this context, legal inhibitions on police power, which remain a vital means of defending individual liberty in working-class democracy, possess limitations that derive from the form of law itself, and which therefore naturally lead working-class organizations to weigh up, in any given situation, the strengths and weaknesses of the various means, including, but not restricted to, legal means by which police powers may be inhibited. Such considerations are ruled out theoretically when the form of law and its function of inhibiting state power are fused together as one. The definition of law as an inhibition of power presupposes the existence of a power alienated from the people, which needs to be inhibited. In the early stages of liberal thought, the idea of the rule of law was invoked to inhibit the authority of the absolute sovereign, but not to transform the nature of the state itself. In later stages, the idea of the rule of law was tied to the transformation of the state itself, from absolutism to liberalism and thence to democracy.
By picking up on the, quote, inhibitory, end quote, rather than the, quote, transformative, end quote, side of this liberal concept, Thompson presupposes the presence of the alien power of the state. To see the rule of law as an unqualified good then means accepting the presence of the bourgeois state as given and immutable. This, quote, pessimistic determinism, end quote, to use Thompson's own term, appears in his projections of the socialist future, where Thompson surmises that even the rise of working-class power based on egalitarian productive relations will require, quote, the negative restriction of bourgeois legalism, end quote, and concludes that any belief in the contrary is a, quote, utopian projection, end quote, without historical warrant. While this position reflects a well-justified rejection of the claims of various socialist states to have overcome their alienation from the people, the very idea of the state, according to Marx, socialist or otherwise, implies an alienation from the people. The state explicitly surrenders the vista. While this position reflects a well-justified rejection of the claims of various socialist states to have overcome their alienation from the people, the very idea of the state, according to Marx, socialist or otherwise, implies an alienation from the people. It explicitly surrenders the vista offered by Marx of the democratization of the state to the point of its dissolution. While Marx saw a place for legal inhibition on state power, as long as the state existed, he also saw as the final goal of communism the dissolution of the state, and with it the need for inhibitions on its power. The more immediate significance, however, of this theory of, quote, inhibition can be again seen in the example of the police. Far from challenging the institution of the police itself, Thompson justifies the police's existence by reference to the police's legitimate functions of internal regulation without asking what ways these functions could be performed other than through the hierarchical bureaucracy of the police, and seeks only to inhibit the police's powers through legal controls. The perspective of transforming the police from a corporate entity above society to a function democratically controlled by society gives way to the more limited perspective of inhibiting police power. Thompson's defense of the rule of law as an unqualified good does not mean that he is blind to the class nature of the actual deployment of law, but he conceived of class domination as an intrusion of quote, class-bound procedures, end quote, into law, and not as an essential characteristic of law itself. Thus he has himself demonstrated how, when considered as an institution, the courts with their class rhetoric and class procedures, or as personnel, quote, the judges, the lawyers, the justices of the peace, end quote, the law may be assimilated to the needs and interests of the ruling class. Quote, but all that is entailed in the, quote, law, end quote, is not subsumed in these institutions. The law may be seen as ideology or as particular rules and sanctions which stand in a definite and active relationship, often in a field of conflict, to social norms. And finally, it may be seen simply in terms of its own logic, rules and procedures, that is, simply as law, end quote. In other words, although Thompson is well aware of the class forces which affect the actual administration of law, he argues that the rule of law contains at its core a, quote, logic of equity that is above class determination, and hence that his own historical studies support his case. And held that his own historical studies support his case. This is at first sight surprising, since they relate for the most part to the ways in which the ruling class and the state have turned the law into little more than an instrument of their own private interest, and how economic forces, quote, actually grabbed hold of the law, throttled the law, and forced the law to change its language and to will into existence forms appropriate to the mode of production, such as enclosure acts and the new case law excluding customary common rights, end quote. But for Thompson, the determination of law by the law's economic base reflects not the essence of law, but its distortion. Concerning his study of the bloody black acts of the 1700s, Thompson comments that it was, quote, centered upon a bad law, drawn by bad legislators, and enlarged by the interpretation of bad judges, end quote. Far from being an indictment of the rule of law itself, it was rather an indictment of the, quote, corruption, end quote, of law. Quote, we feel contempt not because we are contemptuous of the notion of a just and equitable law, but because this notion has been betrayed by its own professors, end quote. It is the idea of law which stands for Thompson as the standard against which to measure the actual corruption of law. Quote, if I judge the Black Act to be atrocious, this is not from some standpoint in natural justice, and not only from the standpoint of those whom the act oppresses, but also according to some ideal notion of the standards to which the, quote, law, end quote, as a regulator of human conflicts of interest, must always seek to transcend the inequalities of class power, which instrumentally the law is harnessed to serve, end quote. In other words, there exists, according to Thompson, a core component in the idea of law which is not locatable in a base superstructure model and which is not reducible to the logic of a class-based functionalism or instrumentalism. In these passages, Thompson comes close to reproducing the, quote, essentialism, end quote, which in his theoretical program he sought to exercise. The idea of law is abstract from its actual deployment in bourgeois society. The quote idea, end quote, of law is abstracted from its actual deployment in bourgeois society, so that its external manifestations appear as corruption of its essence. The key question, then, is to identify the rational kernel of law apart from its mystical and class-ridden shell. If we transfer vegetable metaphors as Thompson peels away the corrupted outer layers of the onion, he may find that it is an arbitrary decision where its rational heart begins. Thompson himself is not very helpful in identifying what he means by the idea of law. At times he refers to the principle of equality embodied in law, which provides a minimum guarantee of liberty in spite of the limitations of its formal character. At times he refers to the principle of, quote, equity, end quote, which in legal terms refers to the use of discretionary powers by the courts to compensate for unfair decisions emanating from the rigid application of formal rules. In one passage, he defines the rule of law as the, quote, regulation of conflicts according to rules of law which are exactly defined and have palpable and material evidence, which rules attain towards consensual consent and are subject to interrogation and reform, end quote. At other times he seems to include in his idea of the rule of law more substantive notions about parliamentary democracy, individual liberty, and labor movement rights of organization. In Thompson's essays on the state of the nation, he presents the libertarians of the left as the protectors of the, quote, institutions of this country, end quote, quote, not the law and order brigade, but the defenders of civil liberties are attempting to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, end quote. In this version, the rule of law would appear to refer to the judicial wing of the bourgeois state that existed up to the recent wave of attacks on traditional liberties. The fact that the, quote, rule of law, end quote, is for Thompson an elastic concept does not mean that it is purely rhetorical, but it does allow him to slip from a position that correctly asserts the significance of formal equality and freedom before the law as a minimum guarantee to liberty to one that depicts 20th century British justice as the incarnation of the rule of law. Thompson rightly rejects the dangerous conclusion that because equality before the law is merely formal or negative, equality before the law should be discarded in favor of substantive justice. This is a view which has historically been adopted by the right. See, for example, Franz Neumann's account of Nazi, quote, legal theory, end quote, in Behemoth, even though the grounds for it have sometimes been laid by the left. But he draws the equally untenable conclusion that the principal institutions of the liberal bourgeois state, parliament, jury trial, quote, independent judiciary, end quote, impartial, end quote, police, etc., are not only preferable to authoritarianism, but are the last word in a free society. The historical record. think I'm actually going to stop here. The historical record. Thompson claims to draw his theoretical conclusions about the rule of law from his historical studies. However, the main theme which runs through his historical writings on the 1700s is a different one, that of a struggle between laws representing absolute and exclusive rights of bourgeois private property and popular movements, falsely defined as criminal by the upper classes and by subsequent orthodox historians, holding on to the use rights of the traditional moral economy. Thus, in The Making of the English Working Class, published in 1963, Thompson writes that the food riots were, quote, a last desperate effort of the people to reimpose the older moral economy as against the economy of the free market, a last desperate attempt to enforce the old paternalist consumer protection, end quote. In Peculiarities of the English in 1965, Thompson argued that until the late 1700s, quote, the common people adhered to a deeply felt, quote, moral economy, end quote, in which the very notion of a, quote, economic price, end quote, for corn, that is, a dissociation between economic values on the one hand and social and moral obligation on the other, was an outrage to their culture. The very category of economics, the notion that it is possible to isolate economic from non-economic social relations, that all human obligations can be dissolved except by the cash nexus, was the product of a particular phase of capitalist evolution, end quote. Plebeian movements in the 18th century and working class movements during the Industrial Revolution should by this account be read as, quote, a movement of resistance to the enunciation of economic man. Sorry, let me repeat that. Plebeian movements in the 1700s and working class movements during the Industrial Revolution should by this account be read as, quote, a movement of resistance to the enunciation of economic man, end quote, and to the laws which heralded it. The, quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, which Thompson represents, thus looks back to these struggles with particular favor, since they were valiant attempts analogous to modern struggles to attain humane welfare services, to hold on to human values in the context of economic dehumanization. In Whigs and Hunters, published in 1975, Thompson pursues this theme in his account of the Black Act, which, quote, signaled the onset of the flood tide of the 1700s retributive justice, end quote. Thompson argues that the act represented the culmination of a social and economic struggle through which a, quote, customary, end quote, economy of forest dwellers was destroyed and replaced by a market-oriented regime based on, quote, capitalist property rights, end quote. In Thompson's view, quote, the forest conflict was in origin a conflict between users and exploiters, end quote. During the 18th century, quote, one legal decision after another signaled that the lawyers had become converted to notions of absolute property ownership, and that the law abhorred the messy complexities of coincident use right, end quote. The traditional rights of the poor either received, quote, perfunctory compensation, end quote, or were simply refined as crimes. Thus the blacks, the poachers and forest dwellers against whom the Black Act was directed, shared something of the character of Hobsbawm's social bandits. They enforced the definition of rights to which the country people were habituated and resisted the development of laws protecting the rights of absolute and exclusive private property. The dominant motif of 18th century British society, the book 18th Century British Society, is that, quote, plebeian culture is rebellious in defense of custom, end quote. Quote, capitalist logic and, quote,
non-economic, end quote, customary behavior are in active and conscious conflict, as in resistance to new patterns of consumption, of time discipline, and to technical innovation or work rationalization which threaten to disrupt customary usage. Hence, we can read 18th century social history as a succession of confrontations between an innovative market economy and the customary moral economy of the plebs, end quote. Thompson does at times modify this version of events. In the quote making, he shows how this appeal to the past was sometimes no more In the making of the English working class, he shows how this appeal to the past was sometimes no more than a cloth in which thoroughly new rights were dressed. Quote, all reformers before Paine, end quote, Thompson commented, quote, commenced with the, quote, corruption of the Constitution, end quote, end quote. The Constitution in question being imaginary versions of the Revolution of 1688 or even of old Saxon law. Such antiquarian arguments such antiquarian arguments were even used to justify the modern demand for manhood suffrage. So too in the book 18th century ... I guess I don't know. He's not spelling out the entirety of the book title, and I forget what it was. So, in the 18th century, Thompson distinguished between the form and content of popular rebellious culture. Quote, this is a conservative culture in its forms. These appeal to custom and seek to reinforce traditional usage. But the content of this culture cannot so easily be described as conservative. End quote. However, the general picture Thompson painted about food rioters, poachers, blacks, smugglers, wreckers, writers of anonymous threatening letters, and the like was one of plebeian rebellion in defense of traditional use rights against laws representing unequivocally the requirements of the newly emergent capitalist economy. Two questions arise. First, how well does this account fit the facts? And second, how much support does it offer to Thompson's defense of the rule of law? On both counts, there are problems. It is an oversimplification and ultimately wrong to reduce all these 18th century struggles to a conflict between traditional use rights and legally enforced private property rights. Quote, plebeian, end quote, rebellion crossed class lines, and many of its participants were advocates of and not rebels against absolute property rights. Although I'm not qualified as a historian of the 1700s, on the basis of Thompson's own historical evidence, the picture seems to be more mixed than he allows, and less easily fitted into the mold of, quote, primitive rebellion, end quote. For example, the popular struggles of poachers and foresters against the Black Act were supported by a cross-class alliance of some small gentry, peasants, capitalist farmers who rented land, laborers, merchants, and craftspeople. This broad support arose from the particular class character of poaching laws, which declared that, to be eligible to hunt game, one had to be a freeholder earning a minimum of £100 a year. This included the large gentry owners and excluded all others. Thus, capitalist farmers were opposed to these laws because the capitalist farmers were excluded from a privilege reserved for the large gentry. Because the capitalist farmers were deprived of valuable rights to the use of land reserved for the pleasures of the hunt, and because the hunt caused damage to the capitalist farmers' farms. It is not surprising, therefore, to find, quote, middling men, end quote, among the foremost in protest against these laws as a, quote, unconstitutional oppression, end quote. Further, as the commercial exploitation of game by innkeepers, poulterers, and victuallers, whatever that means, became more viable, so too their resentment against game laws, which prohibited the selling of game, joined up with the resentment of the farmers. Game was important, as Doug Hay put it, because game symbolized, quote, land, end quote, against commerce. Quote, game laws were the only enforceable remnant of the mass of statutes that once fixed status among Englishmen. Game could not be legally bought and sold because game was meant to symbolize prerogatives, to show that its owner held power and prestige in landed society. End quote. It was, in short, a traditional form of property right that the game laws expressed. The large gentry were, if we are to believe Christopher Hill's account, less concerned with the setting in motion of productive forces characteristic of productive capital than with the appropriation of a finished product. Quote, landlords sought prestige through conspicuous investment rather than conspicuous consumption, buildings, parks, paintings. But such investment, though it created some employment, stimulated the economy far less than a planned program of investment in the capital goods sector and in the improving communications would have done. End quote. The form of the game laws was itself archaic. They set up the right to hunt game as an exclusive privilege of the landed gentry, and achieved this through property qualifications. Such laws were first established in 1389, when the qualification for hunting, quote, gentleman's game, end quote, was set at owning a freehold worth at least £40 a year and lasting 99 years. Wealth itself, unconnected with the land, was excluded from such privileges. In other words, the law recognized privileges based on property qualification. It embodied differential rights and duties based on rank and status. The bourgeois conception of the rule of law that accompanied the development of bourgeois private property, by contrast, was based on the abolition of legal privileges. The administration and implementation of the law was equally imbued with traditional elements. The basis of law enforcement was the, quote, manor, end quote. The lord of the manor had the power to appoint a gamekeeper who served public and private functions at once. The gamekeeper's public function was to enforce the law. The gamekeeper's private function was to serve as servant of the landowner. The sharp division between public and private functions established within liberal legal thought was not yet present. The same interpretation of the public and the private was present in the judicial system. Thompson demonstrated the direct links between landowners and the judiciary with little evidence that the separation of powers advocated by liberalism and established only in the 19th century. Doug Hay has demonstrated how the extensive use of discretionary, quote, crown pardons, end quote, by the judiciary was given on the basis of personal pleas of mercy by the local gentry. It held the victim in a position of personal debt to the landlord and expressed the explicit employment of mechanisms of social control based on personal dependence. Terror and obligation were the two sides of this relation of direct domination. Even the execution of the penalty displayed this traditional class character. The public hanging was a military ceremony which manifested the coercive power of the monarch over his people. Punishment was not applied in the name of the, quote, people, end quote, as became the case in the bourgeois epoch, but was imposed over the people as a show of superior might. It was a ceremony which was intended to manifest the direct domination of the rulers over the ruled, or, as Hay put the matter, an exercise in, quote, terror, end quote. The execution was done in public, and the penalty was painful. The victim was choked to death by the hangman's noose, rather than having his neck, quote, painlessly, end quote, broken, so that the people might witness the power of the ruling class at work, and even see the personal prerogative of the king or the landowner in the case of a last-minute pardon. If offenders were not hanged, offenders might be transported to the colonies in privately owned boats, and on arrival would be subjected to forced labor on behalf of private property.
if by chance offenders went to prison, they would find the prisons run for profit by their keepers and explicit divisions based on rank and wealth practiced within them. The game laws, in short, cannot be seen simply as the embodiment of bourgeois private property, nor can opposition to them be simply fitted into the category of defense of a traditional moral economy. The rebels were as much concerned with the emancipation of private property from traditional fetters as with the defense of use rights. This side of the question slipped into Thompson's own account in Whigs and Hunters when he commented on the, quote, archaic, end quote, character of the Crown's claims and of the laws which declared that land, whether or not privately owned, quote, might not be fenced so high that the deer could not pass through them to their customary feeding grounds, end quote. That, quote, no timber could be felled without license from the forest officers, end quote. And that deer, quite, might not be killed on any pretense whatsoever, end quote. In these instances, the forest struggles might equally be real as a popular defense of absolute private property over traditional use rights claimed by the Crown. The case of excise laws raises similar problems. Widespread popular opposition to them arose from the narrow class interest which these laws expressed. They articulated an alliance between monopoly trading companies like the East India Company and the state. For the former, a royal charter meant monopoly rights as well as the protection of the British Navy over their trading routes. For the latter, it meant a lucrative source of income. It represented the supremacy of merchant capital and a mercantile state. Opposition to the excise law came from merchants and, quote, middling men, end quote, desirous of gaining some share in the lucrative international trade in tea and other reserved commodities, from the middle classes eager to see lower prices for tea both for their own sakes and to lower the value of labor power, and from the, quote, poor, end quote, for whom smuggling meant, for some, work on ships or the opportunity to get a foot in the door of commodity exchange, or at least access to what had been luxury commodities on the popular market. It would appear inadequate to present smuggling as a, quote, plebeian, end quote, activity based on the defense of a, quote, older moral economy, end quote. In the early years of the 1700s, smuggling was predominantly the business of small entrepreneurs who acquired the capital necessary for the pursuit of this trade through one-off ventures like theft. However, as the scale of trade widened, the initial capital necessary to enter the market became increasingly substantial. Smuggling was not only a, quote, plebeian, end quote, but also a bourgeois movement which drew behind it popular support from sections of the population who opposed the vestiges of class privilege and the restrictions on trade represented by the excise laws. This is why bourgeois thinkers like Adam Smith were at the forefront of criticism of the excise laws, just as he was of the game laws. There was no way by which the right to free international trade could legitimately be translated into a traditional custom. Indeed, Smith pointed out that the very term, quote, customs, end quote, as in, quote, customs duty, end quote, derived from the fact that they were, quote, customary payments which had been in use for time immemorial, end quote. Customs duties appear to have been, quote, customs duties appear to have been originally considered as taxes upon the profits of merchants originating in the barbarous times of feudal anarchy, end quote. Tradition was in favor of the, quote, customs, end quote. It was in the name of, quote, natural law, end quote, i.e. modernity, that opposition to it was waged. Smith developed an elaborate critique of the excise laws and campaigned for their repeal, for the lowering of excise duties, and for the end of royal prerogatives to trade. This was not the stuff of primitive rebellion. It is remarkable how the idea of primitive rebellion against laws expressing the development of private property and capitalist economic relations has taken root in Thompson's work, in spite of the contradictory elements which also ran through Thompson's accounts.
It is as if the particular moral Thompson drew from his study of struggles around the price of grain is unproblematically extended to all other areas of 1700s struggle. The reason behind this, I believe, is that there lay an untested prejudice running through Thompson's historical work, resistant to empirical refutation, a romanticism which sees in pre-bourgeois property relations a, quote, human, end quote, state of affairs, which the mass of the people wish to hold on to, and which sees in the development of capitalist property an unmitigated evil, which the mass of the people more or less consciously resist. Both in form and content, however, the laws concerning excise and game were becoming in the 1700s increasingly archaic. In Marx's language, the legal and political superstructure was becoming a block on the development of productive forces. Popular forms of rebellion were as much attempts to break through these blocks as attempts to hold on to the past idyll. Thompson's conclusions reflected precisely the instrumentalist view of law as a protector of bourgeois private property, which Thompson now rightly rejects, for it would appear that this view fails to fit the historical facts as he presents them. The final chapter on the, quote, rule of law, end quote, in Whigs and Hunters, which presents the rule of law as, quote, an unqualified human good, end quote, seems to me, therefore, to be in part a self-criticism. Thompson's attempts to break from his own past perspective. His alternative, however, does not solve the problem either. Thompson's history reveals not so much the, quote, corruption, end quote, of the rule of law in the 1700s, but the fact that this rule of law was in large measure still an image in the eye of classical jurisprudence and not yet a fully accomplished reality. It was still in possession of all kinds of traditional characteristics, unequal privileges, the fusion of public and private functions, a scarcely existent base in, quote, consensual assent, end quote, which were later to be superseded. Thompson can turn this period into one of the, quote, corruption, end quote, of law only by turning the law itself into a timeless ideal rather than a specific social form of regulation coming to being in this period. At one moment, Thompson presents the conflict between traditional use rights and private property rights as one between, quote, two quote, alternative, end quote, notions of the rule of law. In this view, Thompson recognizes that the form of law changes from one period to the next, for example, from natural law to positive law, that its content changes, e.g., from the defense of use rights to that of absolute property rights, that its institution changes, e.g., from forest to magistrates' courts. But the rule of law itself appears in Thompson's eyes to transcend these historical transformations. Quote, it is not possible to conceive of any complex society without law, end quote. However, traditional natural law concepts of property did not possess the egalitarian, universal, and humanistic properties Thompson associates with the, quote, rule of law, end quote. It is not possible to marry traditional natural law theory, rooted in privilege, inequality, dependence, obligation, and immutable laws, with any of Thompson's definitions of the, quote, rule of law, end quote. At other times, Thompson treats the rule of law as an ideal which emerged out of the, quote, work of 16th and 17th century jurists, supported by the practical struggles of such men as Hampden and Lilburne, end quote, which was passed down as, quote, a legacy, end quote, to the 18th century, but violated systematically in practice, to which the bourgeoisie finally succumbed in the 19th century after a period of direct repression, as exemplified by the Peterloo massacre, and which is now being threatened by an increasingly authoritarian state. As an expression of bourgeois ascendancy, however, the rule of law was directly connected with the emergence of absolute private property right. Private property and the rule of law cannot be dissociated from one another. Thompson's overcritical view of private property makes a poor partner for his undercritical view of the rule of law. The same Adam Smith, who is the arch-villain in the saga of private property, is at once the hero of the saga of the rule of law. Just as private property is not an unqualified human bad, so too
the rule of law is not an unqualified human good. Private property and the rule of law both reflect the limited character of bourgeois emancipation. The final contradiction in Thompson's theorizing about law is that his idealization of the rule of law violates his own humanistic belief in the, quote, unitary, end quote, character of law. Economics, politics, and culture. Under the rule of law, as Trotsky put it, quote, the landlord, the laborer, the capitalist, the proletarian, the minister, the bootblack are equal as, quote, citizens and as, quote, legislators, end quote, end quote. The abstraction of juridic subjects from their experience as producers is completed. The rule of law expresses the very fetish of law as a force remote from productive relations that Thompson so powerfully criticizes. Conclusion: that Marxism must ally with liberalism in the defense of civil liberties and democratic rights against their erosion by the state is beyond question. One way of reading Thompson is to see him as offering a critique of sterile sectarian Marxism, which abstains from this joint struggle. The important question, however, is not whether an alliance between Marxism and liberalism is necessary, but rather on what terms that alliance should be forged. By presenting the liberal idea of the, quote, rule of law, end quote, as an unqualified human good, and by excluding a Marxist critique of the rule of law's limitations, Thompson advocates an alliance based in effect on the subordination of Marxism to liberalism. With the nightmare of Stalinist and authoritarian right-wing states before his eyes, Thompson perceived that workers prefer the, quote, rule of law, end quote, to both and are right to do so. But Thompson thereby surrenders the vista of a far more radical democracy than that envisaged in liberal constitutions put forward by Marx. In a context in which the right wing is successfully exploiting the contradictions inherent in the old, quote, rule of law, end quote, and the dissatisfactions of many workers with its failures in practice, as witnessed by the level of popular support mobilized behind, quote, law and order, end quote, campaigns, Thompson's recipe for a purely defensive struggle in support of traditional liberal constitutions is unlikely to stem the tide. Just as the defense of welfare requires also the democratization of welfare's bureaucracy and the self-activity of recipients and workers, so too defense of the rule of law, if it is to require popular support, requires a level of democratization of the courts, the judiciary, the legal profession, the police, prisons, etc., and a level of self-activity by ordinary people which the old liberal constitution did not envisage in its appeal to the rule of law, but which was the ABC of Marx's critique. In this context, it is vital that Marxists retain the independence of their critique of the limitations of liberalism, even as they join hands with liberals in a common struggle against a right-wing authoritarianism that falsely seeks to appropriate for itself the title of, quote, defender of, quote, the rule of law, end quote. Power without people. Michel Foucault. While Pashukanis and Thompson offer critiques of private property law and the state within the Marxist tradition, the French historian and philosopher Michel Foucault has purported to represent views that are an advance over Marxism. Foucault's approach, which rejects the categories of private property, law, and the state in favor of that of power, has gained wide influence even among Marxists and has undoubtedly made a stimulating contribution to the modern debate. The adequacy of Foucault's critique not only of Marxism but also of liberalism is my focus. Foucault describes his own critique of power as having been made possible by the May 1968 revolt in France. In his view, this revolt opened the way towards a perspective on power which demands new historical concepts, new ways of theorizing, and new strategic options for resistance. Foucault argues that the Foucault argued that the revolt of May 1968 made possible and necessary a radical break from all traditional theories of power and traditional conceptions of struggle, including those of Marxism. The question posed by 1968, as Foucault put it, was, quote, how can revolutionary movements free themselves from the, quote, Marx effect, end quote, end quote. Foucault presented himself as a, quote, post-Marxist, end quote, one who, in the words of his admirer, Gilles Deleuze, quote, achieved a theoretical revolution directed not only at bourgeois theories of the state, but at the Marxist conception of power and the state, end quote. In the eyes of his followers, Foucault appears to have transcended divisions between left and right, materialism and idealism, socialism and capitalism. In reality, Foucault expressed many of the themes embraced by the New Left, including many Marxists, but he was to give to them his own particular twist. The strength of the spirit of anti-authoritarianism, which invested the struggles of 1968, was that it attempted to break through the grip of Stalinism on the one hand and reformism on the other, both of which tended to idealize existing forms of power or else to ignore existing forms of power altogether by concentrating exclusively on the realm of economics. The anti-authoritarianism of 1968 represented, in its youthful way, a head-on attack against this consensus. Practically every aspect of the operation of power was subjected to critical scrutiny. The state, the family, the hospital, the asylum, and the prison appeared as symbols of a, quote, despotic, end quote, power which continues to be exercised both in the East and the West, and also as signs of the failure of the left to come to grips with the question of power. In socialist theoretical works, such issues had been largely ignored, and on the practical side, the coming to power of socialist movements left these institutions solidly intact. In Foucault's eyes, a radical politics worth its salt would have to overthrow such monuments to despotism. Equally important, he thought, was the need for a new theoretical approach capable of understanding the exercise of power in modern, quote, disciplinary society, end quote. History had shown that new classes may seize control of power without altering power's mode of operation. A politics exclusively oriented to the seizure of power neglects the revolutionary task of securing a transition from one form of power to another, to a form of power in which neither prisons nor asylums would have a place. Power is not centralized exclusively in the state, nor is power exclusively the property of one class. Rather, power is exercised in multiple centers, each with its own distinctive characteristics. It is not adequate to reduce the question of power in the asylum, the prison, the factory, the family, etc., to that of the state or ruling class, nor to assume that the despotism within these institutions will automatically disappear with the overthrow of a particular state or class. Just as there are multiple centers of power, so too there are multiple sources of resistance. From school children, students, prisoners, psychiatric inmates, women, factory workers, and so forth, each engaging in particular localized struggles, resistance does not stem from one single source, whether that source be the working class conceived of as a uniform entity or the party, but each of these struggles has its own distinctive integrity. Since power is not the exclusive possession of a particular class, it cannot be a purely rational means of securing class relations. Power is never simply, quote, functional for capital, but the contradictions in its exercise inevitably lead to the constant regeneration of resistance. Nor is power something purely, quote, negative, end quote, or, quote, repressive, end quote. Power does not merely deny freedom. Power also plays a, quote, positive, end quote, role in creating atomized, servile, docile, or at least manageable individuals. The form of, quote, disciplinary, end quote, power embodied in prisons, asylums, factories, and families is not simply given in nature, nor is it a property of every social order, but is rather a definite historical relation whose beginnings one can trace and whose end one can foresee. Finally, the privileged position of science should not be automatically justified. Rather, knowledge and power are inextricably linked, as the close connections between, quote, sciences, end quote, like psychiatry and criminology, and institutions like asylums and prisons clearly show. This understanding of the link between knowledge and power must be incorporated in critical theory, lest it should itself become a kind of elitism, monopolizing knowledge of the, quote, truth, and dismissing all other beliefs as, quote, false consciousness, end quote. Foucault was not wrong to take off from themes which represented a revival of left criticism about power in the state. However, around the kernel of truth contained in these observations, Foucault built an elaborate mystical shell. Foucault's anti-Marxism stemmed in part from a mistaken identification of some kinds of vulgar Marxism, for example, that of the French Communist Party with Marxism in general. It does not need reiterating at this stage that Marx saw revolution not merely as a transfer of power from one class to another, but also a transition from one form of power to another form of power, in which the transformation of the asylum and the prison should be one element. Marx did not see the seizure of the state as the solution to all oppression. Foucault's anti-Marxism was not, however, just based on a misunderstanding. It also stemmed from a real disagreement with Marx. It was basically an opposition between materialism and formalism. While Marx argued that forms of power cannot be divorced from their social content, i.e., who wields the power, what function power plays, etc., Foucault, starting from a critique of analyses of power which ignored or idealized power's forms, ended up paying exclusive attention to power's forms and rejecting the very idea that there is a social content beneath those forms. Slipping from the observation that power is not the exclusive property of a particular class, Foucault draws the conclusion that power is not a property of people at all. Individuals who appear to hold power are not, in fact, quote, the vis-a-vis of power, but rather one of power's prime effects. The question, end quote, the question of who wields power is false, for power creates its own human subjects. The empirical starting point for Foucault was that the often bureaucratic forms of authority embodied in what he called the, quote, disciplines, end quote, frequently appear impersonal on their surface. They seem to be under no human control, and the individuals who exercise authority, prison guards, asylum nurses, etc., may appear to be appendages of power rather than power being an attribute of them. Critical theory must come to terms with the depersonalization of authority in the modern world, not reduce it to an ideology obscuring class rule in the manner of vulgar Marxism. The difference between Foucault and Marx, however, lies in their respective analyses of depersonalized authority, not in their assessments of its reality. Marxists argue that everywhere and always power is an expression of social relations between people. The form and the content of power changes with time and place, but not its human foundation. People always remain the real subjects of power, even if at times people appear as no more than power's predicate. If power appears impersonal, it is because relations between individuals give rise to a fetishized form. The task of theoretical criticism is to reveal the human relations which lie hidden beneath the fetish of a power abstracted from people, as a first step towards the practical task of making it possible for people to take control of power rather than for power to determine the fate of people. The fetish for power is real in modern society. Individuals are subsumed under impersonal structures of law, bureaucracy, and state, but the social basis of this form of subordination should be revealed in order to demystify the fetish. Against this whole mode of criticism, Foucault argued that in the past, when power was a possession of monarch and lords, it was personal. Now, however, with the advent of disciplinary power, its very substance has changed. The surface form of discipline is its reality. There is nothing beneath this surface, no hidden, quote, hidden text, end quote. For Foucault, people are the predicate of power, while power is the transmogrified. Power is transmogrified into an impersonal subject. Between, quote, traditional and, quote, disciplinary forms of power, there is a historical break marking not the transfer of power from one class of people to another class of people, nor a change in how people exercise power, but a transubstantiation of power itself from a human attribute to an impersonal entity. Thus, only a formalism can capture the contemporary truth that power is an impersonal machine divorced from human agency. Foucault turns power into an independent entity that strides over the human world and molds the human world according to power's own will. Foucault's formalism turns the mystique of disciplinary power into the essence of power itself. It may now appear that it is power that constitutes individuals, not individuals who constitute power. This was why Foucault made a principle out of not digging beneath the surface forms of power, out of elevating what he saw as the quote, politics of everyday life, end quote, into the only politics. To get at the heart of power, Foucault insisted, we should not look for hidden social forces behind the, quote, great upheavals, end quote, but rather grasp power at the point where it touches the individuals at what he calls power's, quote, capillary forms of existence, end quote. Foucault offered a kind of reverse phenomenology based not on how the individual experiences the world, but in how the world manifests itself to individuals. Since power makes itself felt on individuals as a suprahuman force, this indeed is the truth of power. Foucault polemicized against what he saw as the arbitrary nature of, quote, interpretation, end quote. The search beneath the text for what people, quote, really, end quote, mean leads, he thought, to an endless number of possible interpretations, none of which has any inherent superiority. It therefore becomes a matter of caprice or of power which interpretation is chosen as correct. The solution to this problem of authority, he argued, was to give up the illusion of a, quote, subtext, end quote. His position was that of treating others as neither meaning what they say nor knowing what they mean. The, quote, interpreter, end quote, acquires for him or herself a privileged status. Interpretation appears to Foucault as an act of power which subordinates the discourse of others and elevates the discourse of the interpreter as a scientist, political leader, doctor, etc. However, the fact that some forms of interpretation are protected against criticism and public debate does not mean that all interpretation should be abandoned. Foucault himself cannot avoid, quote, interpretation, end quote. This becomes particularly apparent when power relations present themselves in distinct and contradictory forms. For example, in modern capitalist society, power presents itself both as a self-sufficient machine in which, quote, everyone is caught, end quote, and which, quote, no one owns, end quote, and juridically in terms of the rights of individuals. But how does Foucault resolve the problem of dual appearances? By interpreting the juridic aspect of power to be no more than a, quote, mask, and its disciplinary aspect to be real. The same problem confronted Foucault in his explanation for the development of the modern penitentiary. Its founders, the penal reformers of the late 1700s, campaigned under the banner of, quote, rights of man, end quote, for a more humane form of punishment than that of the house of correction, public execution, torture, galley slavery, and the like, and believed that the, quote, penitentiary, end quote, would provide a humane environment in which criminals could be reformed into good and useful citizens. At the same time, penal reformers also argued that penitentiaries would constitute a more effective, rational, complete form of control over the criminal class, a place that would induce such suffering of the soul that others would be deterred and the inmate cowed into submission. Both these images existed side by side. Some reformers emphasized the, quote, human, end quote, aspect of penal reforms, others their, quote, control, end quote, aspects, and others linking the control and human aspects together, as was the case in the vivid phrase, quote, cords of love, chains of iron, end quote, used to describe the principle of the penitentiary and echoed in Michael Ignatieff's account of its origins. Foucault's solution to the problem of two apparently conflicting surface forms was to declare that, quote, the true objective of the reform movement was not so much to establish a new right to punish based on more equitable principles as to set up a new economy of the power to punish, to assure its better distribution, to render it more regular, effective, constant, and detailed in its effects. Not to punish less, but to punish better. It is this, quote, economic rationality, end quote, that must calculate the penalty. Quote, humanity, end quote, is the respectable name given to this economy and its meticulous calculation, end quote. Quote, humanity, end quote, appeared thus as a mask, while, quote, rationality, end quote, appeared as the essence of this new apparatus of power. Foucault interpreted the utilitarian side of bourgeois ideology as the truth, and its humanitarian side as an illusion. His cynical view of reform, however, assumed the bourgeois humanism. Foucault's cynical view of reform, however, assumed that bourgeois humanism was an empty shell without giving any credence to the progressive character of campaigns against torture, public executions, animal-like conditions in the houses of confinement, and so forth, nor to the campaigns for a reform of punishment that would be reformative rather than retributive. On the other hand, Foucault ignored the possibility that penal reformers were grossly exaggerating the effectiveness and utility of their own inventions. Foucault should not have taken at face value the hard line of rational control any more than the soft language of human rights, whereas he conveyed a skepticism concerning the humane side of bourgeois reforms. Foucault was uncritical about their claims to rationality. This is apparent in Foucault's critique of Bentham's Panopticon. The Panopticon was Bentham's utopian design for a model prison, asylum, school, or workshop. Bentham advertised the Panopticon as a, quote, new mode of power of mind over mind, in a quantity hitherto without example, secured by whoever chooses to have it so against abuse, end quote. Bentham described it as, quote, a mill for grinding rogues honest, a method of becoming master of everything which might happen to men, a very powerful and very useful instrument which governments might apply to various objects of the utmost importance, end quote. Parliament was not taken in by Bentham's inflated claims and rejected his design, but Foucault did little more than echo Bentham's utilitarian fantasy about creating a complete technology of power. Quote, the Panopticon made it possible to perfect the exercise of power, a marvelous machine which, whatever use one may wish to put it to, produces homogeneous effects of power, a functional mechanism that must improve the exercise of power by making it lighter, more rapid, more effective, a design of subtle coercion for a society to come, end quote. Foucault reversed the value judgment Bentham bestowed on the Panopticon, presenting the Panopticon as a, quote, extreme form, end quote, of despotism, but the substance of their analysis was the same. Foucault's characterization of disciplinary power as, quote, rational, end quote, functional, end quote, etc., meant that instead of examining the tensions between the form of power and power's social functions, Foucault defined the form of power in terms of its functionality, thus creating an apparent identity between the two. Foucault's formalism led him not to see the contradiction inherent in the exercise of power, as Foucault initially hoped, but to construct an image of omnipotence. Power appeared as a self-sufficient entity, whose only purpose is the maintenance of its own mastery. This thesis was clearly apparent in his critique of prisons, where he described the prison as, quote, as a, quote, extreme form, end quote, of disciplinary power. However, bearing in mind the fact that prisons consistently fail to live up to their own ideals of reforming inmates into good and useful citizens, it would seem that this most functional of powers turns out not to work at all well. Foucault saved his thesis by turning to what he saw as the latent function of prison power, that of producing, in the form of, quote, delinquency, end quote, a politically safe form of resistance that is easy to accommodate, supervise, and control. The political rationality of prisons is, however, no more assured, as is shown by their incapacity to contain collective political revolts than their penal rationality. It is only in periods of stability that the functioning of prisons, like that of the state in general, appears convincing. For Foucault, since the form of power is everything, and power produces its own reality, there can be no obstacles to its apparent efficacy. The prison becomes the symbol of omnipotence. Foucault's explanation for the historical development of disciplinary forms of power took off from a rejection of orthodox liberal accounts of, quote, progress, end quote, which explain them in terms of an advance in knowledge or in moral sensibility. He went further, however, by denying any progressive content to the penal, educational, health, and other reforms and revolutions which emerged out of the Enlightenment. He also rejected the economic functionalism and reductionism which Marxists sometimes offer on the grounds that disciplinary power, quote, functions to reproduce capital, end quote, or, quote, serves the interest of the ruling class, end quote. Foucault rejected any explanation of power in terms of social relations external to or independent of power itself. Since power, in Foucault's view, produces reality, there can exist nothing outside power to act as grounds for change. Power appeared as power's own premise, explicable only in terms of power's inner dynamics. Foucault's formalism led him at times to abandon the search for a causal explanation altogether in favor of a synchronic morphology of power, at times to construct a theory of, quote, historical discontinuity, end quote, according to which the, quote, leap, end quote, from one historical form of power to another, for example, quote, traditional, end quote, to, quote, disciplinary, end quote, appears as an inexplicable fact based on, quote, chance, end quote, unpredictability, end quote, invention, end quote, at times to postpone the job of explanation to a later stage when his description of discipline is more complete. A causal explanation for discipline, nevertheless, did slip into Foucault's work and colored his conclusions in a very profound way. He located the growth of disciplinary power in the process of capital accumulation, but made no distinction between capitalist development and industrial development in general. What led to the emergence of the hierarchical, non-reciprocal, top-down structures of power that make up discipline, in Foucault's view, was the growth of large-scale production irrespective of large-scale production's class form, the need to organize individuals, quote, rationally, end quote, into a cooperative labor force, to make their work, quote, useful, end quote, to, quote, regulate their movements, end quote, to fix them into a social labor process, to, quote, clear up confusions, end quote, and to neutralize the effects of individual resistance made inevitable, in Foucault's view, the parallel development of despotic apparatuses of disciplinary control. Although Foucault referred to Marx's discussion of, quote, cooperative labor, end quote, in the book Capital, the contrast between their accounts is sharp. Cooperation between individuals in production appeared to Marx in itself to be positive, in respect both of the productivity of labor and to the personal well-being of individuals. Every cooperative labor process requires some form of control to, quote, secure the harmonious cooperation of the activities of individuals, end quote. But the particular form of control is determined by the, quote, social, end quote, as well as the, quote, technical, end quote, character of production. Thus, the authoritarian character of the control exercised by the capitalist over the labor process arose not from the requirements of regulating social labor, but from the, quote, unavoidable antagonism between the exploiter and the raw material of his exploitation, end quote. For Marx, it was the conflict between capital and labor which led capital to exercise control in such authoritarian ways. For Foucault, it was the development of a rational cooperative labor process that induced this authoritarianism. Foucault's view reflected his general formalism, since on the surface it appeared that it was cooperative labor itself that was despotic. Because, as Marx pointed out, the capitalist form of cooperation developed historically, in opposition to peasant agriculture and petty bourgeois handicraft, it did not appear as a particular historical form of cooperation. Rather, cooperation appeared as a phenomenon peculiar to capitalist production. In fact, it had taken many social forms prior to capitalism. Further, because workers under capitalism are isolated from one another, until they are brought together by capital, cooperation appears as an attribute of capital itself. All the authoritarian aspects of capitalist cooperation are thus projected onto cooperation itself. For this reason, Foucault's critique of the disciplinary power ended up as an objection to cooperation and collectivity as such, in terms of his initial proposal that power should not be seen in terms of the repression of individual liberty. His critique was in fact based on the antagonism between the freedom of the individual and the despotism of the collective. The more socialized production becomes, the more individuals are included in cooperative labor processes. Foucault concluded, the more, quote, disciplinary, end quote, society will become. The same opposition to collectivity which led Foucault to a critique of bourgeois forms of power also set Foucault against socialist forms. since Foucault's objection to bourgeois society was directed not at private ownership, but at private ownership's tendency towards the socialization of labor, the further socialization of labor at the expense of private ownership envisaged in socialism appeared to Foucault not as an emancipation, but as a despotism. The rebirth of the prison in the grotesque form of the Gulag archipelago in the Soviet Union thus appeared as part of the logic, not the corruption, of socialism. In spite of his opposition to a, quote, repressive, end quote, view of power, Foucault believed that power itself necessarily breeds resistance regardless of who wields that power, how it is exercised, or what uses power is put to. However, since resistance is the product of power, he stressed the danger of reproducing existing forms on power rather than overcoming them. On the one hand, individualized rebellion in the form of crime and delinquency is politically impotent. On the other, socialist forms of struggle, based around the collective organization of labor, reproduce the very disciplinary mechanisms against which they are set. Foucault's whole approach did not let him entertain the possibility that workers might develop collective forms of organization different from and more democratic than those of capital. Quote, discipline, end quote, therefore appeared endemic in socialist forms of struggle. Foucault's alternative to socialism was not clear. Foucault picked up on ideas with a much broader left currency about fragmentary local struggles, each with its own autonomy, coming together in temporary, spontaneous alliances without, quote, global, end quote, direction or organization. He wrote vaguely about the need to replace the, quote, global synthesis, end quote, of struggle epitomized in the Marxist conception of the party by a, quote, strategic codification of multiple points of resistance, end quote. In other words, he saw the fragmentary and spontaneous nature of the struggles of 1968 not as their limitations but as their strength. The danger lay in their organization. Foucault rejected the scientific elitism which he saw as endemic in Marxist theory. To this end, Foucault advocated the replacement of, quote, science by a, quote, genealogy that will, quote, entertain the claims to attention to local, discontinuous, disqualified, illegitimate knowledges against the claims of a unitary body of theory which would filter, hierarchize, and order them in the name of some true knowledge, end quote. In Foucault's eyes, quote, science, end quote, i.e. the search for truth and hidden meanings, represents authoritarianism and dogma. Quote, genealogy, end quote, i.e. the reactivation of local knowledges, represents tolerance and resistance. Quote, truth, end quote, is a function of power, not of reason. Marxism's commitment to, quote, truth, end quote, is a symbol of its repressiveness. When Foucault as a historian examined past forms of knowledge and unpacked those past forms of knowledge, he did not assess their truth or validity. When he examined, quote, local knowledges, end quote, replete as they are with sexism, racism, and conservative prejudices, as well as with the spirit of spontaneity and revolt, he accepted them as they are for fear of imposing an arbitrary truth. He thus rejected the Enlightenment tradition inherited by Marx that the, quote, search for truth, end quote, is the condition of democratic criticism and of the breakdown of arbitrary authority. To treat other people and their view in an egalitarian way, according to this tradition, is to engage critically with the truth of what they say, not to abstract what they say from any connection with truth. The elitism inherent in Foucault's view of knowledge is that it allowed him to treat all other, quote, knowledges, end quote, as equal only in the sense that they are all deprived of truth value, while his own, quote, knowledge, end quote, transcends the many varieties of common sense discourse. Rather than engage with Marxism in open and rational debate about the nature and causes of disciplinary power, Foucault invalidated it as a, quote, science, end quote, and so bypassed the question of which approach is closer to the truth. In fact, Foucault offered a thoroughly, quote, global, end quote, scientific, end quote, theory of discipline, and indeed interpreted all struggles everywhere as fundamentally struggles against discipline. Foucault's laudable desire to emancipate illegitimate knowledges ended up by discounting them. Foucault's analysis of disciplinary society was based on the supposition that law and representative democracy are empty forms under which discipline reigns supreme. This approach tended to obscure ways in which relations between the law, parliament, and the, quote, disciplines, end quote, are changing, to discount struggles for legal rights and democratic accountability of disciplinary apparatuses, to downplay distinctions between one kind of discipline and another, prison and school, police and welfare, and to gloss over the transition from the welfare to the police state. The key, however, to Foucault's theory of discipline was its denial of the existence of private property, law, and the state. It was in some respects like Renard's theory of institutionalism, current in the 1930s. Foucault equated the state with absolutism and argued that as absolutism met its death, so too did the state in general. State sovereignty disappears for Foucault, since the state is reduced to a collection of, quote, institutions, end quote, whose power is, quote, everywhere, end quote, in society, and is thus identified with the power of the organized community itself. The concept of the state implies that there are people, a group, a class, particular individuals, who exercise the sovereignty attributed to the state. While the concept of state sovereignty obscures the real social character of those who rule, it has the merit of revealing that there are people who rule. It conceals, but it does not eliminate the bearer of power. Foucault's, quote, abolition, end quote, of the state does not only conceal the social character of the bearers of power, it eliminates the bearers themselves. The category of private property owner, legal subject, and the state, for all the mystification they engender, still point to power as an attribute of people. Foucault's rejection of these categories deepens the mystification by abstracting power from power's bearers altogether. In a situation in which power is being concentrated in ever fewer hands, this approach is a dangerous delusion. Like Foucault, Marxism rejects a liberal approach to history which idealizes existing forms of power and views the past in terms of their attainment or absence. However, Marxism also rejects a form of anti-liberalism which reduces all liberalizing reforms to no more than a mechanism of social control or means of meeting the economic needs of capital. From this standpoint, it would be as doctrinaire to discount in its entirety the progressiveness of the penal reform movement around the turn of the 18th or 19th centuries as to idealize it as the bearer of truth and light. It was a great advance to conceive of punishment as a means of turning individuals into good and useful human beings, even though from the beginning this took the abstract and oppressive form of the modern prison. On this basis, Marxism stands for the abolition of prisons, not in order to return to the old coercion, but rather to construct a form of authority that would genuinely humanize those who engage in antisocial behavior, instead of a penal system based on a formal commitment to socialize the antisocial, that it contradicts at every moment by its presuppositions: isolation, atomization, exclusion, silence, passive obedience, bureaucracy, and division. Marxism stands for the, quote, smashing, end quote, of the prison system and its replacement by a form of regulation based on collectivity, individual rights, internal democracy, discussion, and creative labor. The early liberal reformers advertising their penal inventions as models of a truly human community, as far from the truth was this, that their prisons and asylums required mighty walls and iron security to keep real individuals within these supposedly human bounds. The reformers sought to construct an environment which was, on the one hand, more human than conditions on the outside, and on the other, more painful. Thus, reform was linked to deterrence, humanity to suffering. While liberalism sees a synthesis between these, Marxism sees what there in fact is, nothing but contradiction. For Foucault, humanism is nothing but a veil for despotism. For Marxism, the problem with liberal humanism is that liberal humanism is abstract, incomplete, contradicted by its own premises. A, quote, human, end quote, institution does not presuppose the abolition of social control and discipline. but rather a new form of social control and discipline. The point is not merely to negate liberalism abstractly, as Foucault does from the perspective of an anti-collectivism, which is in fact but a one-sided expression of the very liberalism he rejects. It is rather to transcend liberalism theoretically and practically from the perspective of a more social form of collective authority. Within socialist literature, we find just the beginnings of an outline of the kind of institutions which might replace prisons, such as Makarenko's Road to Life, an account of a, quote, colony, end quote, for juvenile delinquents in Russia in the 1920s. Foucault's approach allows him to offer no perspective on this question.